There is a propaganda battle being waged today, and you need to know about it. And here to talk about that propaganda battle is our good friend, Derek Gilbert. Hi, Derek. How are you?
Hi, Gary. It's an honor to be here.
It's great to have you here. And, of course, off camera, you and I have just had a mile-a-minute conversation. There's so much to talk about. Derek, and, by the way, his wife, Sharon, have produced this book called Veneration. And when I read this book, the thing that kept haunting me is this is going on right now. When you look at cable TV, you look at the movie listings, you see a propaganda battle, and it features supernatural characters, the Avengers, and super this and super that, and the kids are being spoon-fed on superhuman creatures and all of their exploits. And some of them are even heroes, like Thor is a hero.
Yeah.
But when you read about the real Thor, he's no hero.
No. This has been going on for a long time, and this has really informed the research that Sharon and I have been doing for some years now. It's led to several books now, and more books in the wings. But I remember as a kid getting hold of my cousin's comic book collection and seeing the very first issue of Thor versus Hercules, and just being really caught up in the story. But now, I've got to confess, the Avengers films, the Thor movies are very entertaining. Thor is portrayed as a very likable character. But when you understand who he is the storm god of the ancient Germanic religion. In that role, he is equated with Jupiter of the Romans, Zeus of the Greeks, Baal of the Bible. And as Baal and as Zeus, Jesus identified that character as Satan. So 2,000 years ago, Christians would have known, hey, this is not a good guy. Now, he's a chart-topping Hollywood blockbuster leading action hero.
He really is. And, I think back to Josephus, and going back to the beginning of the story, where he speaks of Genesis 6 by saying that the sons of God who came down to the daughters of men were the ones called Titans.
Yes.
And Josephus actually uses that word. Now, the Titans are demigods, and we used to think that the Titans were sort of fictional characters. Mm-hmm. Now, looking at the Bible and a lot of extant literature, we're beginning to see that the Titans were real people.
Well, the Titans were the old gods of the Greeks. They were the ones who ruled the earth under their king Kronos until the Olympians, led by Zeus, the storm god, rebelled against them and banished them to Tartarus, which was not the same as Hades. That's a separate level of the underworld, as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven, and it was reserved for supernatural threats to the divine order. But this myth is repeated in a number of ancient religions. The Hittites and Hurrians believed that there were old gods who'd been overthrown by their storm god called Teshub. The Canaanites, the Amorites, believed that their storm god, Hadad, called Baal in the Bible, had taken over for their creator god El. You go back further into Babylon, where Marduk, a storm god, replaced Enlil at the top of the pantheon. This was repeated over and over, and in each case, the old gods were moved or banished to the netherworld, or to the abyss, or to Tartarus, as the new gods took over. Well, we see in 2 Peter a hidden reference to these old gods. Right. 2 Peter 2, verse 4 talks about God didn't spare the angels when they sinned, but thrust them down to hell. Well, the word translated hell in English is in Greek, tartarau. It's the only place it's used in the Bible, which means it's important. We need to take note. Literally means thrust down to Tartarus. Again, there's a difference between Tartarus and Hades, and certainly Peter knew the difference, writing under the influence of the Holy Spirit. He was talking about the angels who sinned, and if you read 2 Peter 2 in context, or Jude 6, 7, 8, 9, it's clear that in context, they're referring to angels who committed a sexual sin, and the only place in the Bible we see that is Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. The Watchers who descended made a mutual pact on the summit of Mount Hermon, which we know from the book of 1 Enoch. Those are to be equated with the Titans of Greek myth, the old gods of the Hittites, and the Anunnaki of ancient Sumer. The story just retold, but the Bible has the accurate account.
Now, my curiosity at this point, and by the way, I'm speaking to our audience because I want them, and I want everybody, I think, as many people as possible, to know what's in this book. How would you describe what's in this book? It's an expose, I would call it.
That's a good way of describing it. We did a deep dive into the theology and the history of the Nephilim. As they were destroyed, condemned by God and destroyed, we know from the book of Enoch, and this was the understanding of the apostles and the early church,
Right, it
that their
was.
spirits became demons. But in fact, even the pagan Greeks understood that the spirits of the heroes who lived during the golden age when Kronos ruled in heaven, in other words, the pre-flood world, when they died, their spirits proceeded from them. They were called daemons. They attracted cult, in other words, worship or veneration, hence the title of the book.
And by the way, if you read the ancient Greek histories and philosophies, they think of the demons as their friend.
Exactly right. That was the key difference. The Greeks and the early church and the Jewish scholars of the centuries before the birth of Jesus understood that demons had the same origin point. They just had a very different view of their nature.
And Hesiod, for example, actually said this. He said that demons are our friends. And then he proceeds to go forth with a little kind of an instruction on how to get close to these people, because if you get close to them, they will bless you.
Yes.
They will bring you good things.
But what we show in Veneration is that secular scholars in peer-reviewed research have shown that the Greeks didn't invent this idea on their own, that they drew it from the Semitic cultures, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hebrews, who understood that the Rephaim were the spirits of the Nephilim destroyed in the flood. A scholar by the name of Amar Anus wrote a paper in 1999 in which he titled, Are There Greek Rephaim? And showed that the origin of these demigod heroes of the Greeks were actually the Rephaim spirits who were venerated by the Canaanites and the Amorites. We found in our research that this idea that spirits continued on after death and interceded or intervened in the affairs of mortal humans was a basic part of the worldview of the Amorites, who dominated the world of the Bible from the time of Abraham through the time of the Exodus, but their influence continued down through the time of Jesus Christ. They believed that the ancestors, the parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who had gone on before, had to be summoned once a month in a necromancy ritual. It was always held on the 30th of the month, the night of no moon in a lunar calendar. The ritual was called Kispum, and they would summon their ancestors by name for a ritual meal where they would feed the ancestors. They had to give them bread and drink, water or wine. The ancestors were buried below the floor of the house, and in many cases, a tube was installed down to the corpse so that water could be poured out. In fact, the heir who was responsible, the oldest son usually, for performing this ritual every month was called the pourer of water. And the Mesopotamians, the Amorites, believed that if their descendants didn't perform the rituals faithfully, they would be condemned to eat dust and clay for all eternity and live a miserable life in the afterlife. In fact, that explains, we think, why Abraham was so distressed about not having an heir. He didn't think he was going to have anyone, a blood relative, who would perform the ritual so that he and Sarah would be fed after death, because he didn't have the understanding of the afterlife that God revealed to Moses and then to the prophets and the apostles.
I'm going to read from Isaiah 14. And by the way, we're going in a specific direction here. Stay with us. This is complex, but Derek has done so much research. Isaiah 14, 19. It says, thou shalt not be joined, and 19 and 20, by the way, but thou art cast out of the grave like an abominable branch, and as a raiment of those who are slain, thrust through with a sword, those that go down to the stones of the pit as a carcass trodden under feet. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be removed. And we have a mystery enemy here being spoken of. And the reason I want to bring this up, not only do you use this as a topic verse in your book, but it marks what's going on for me, because there is a propaganda battle. And when Isaiah talks about these evil ones, you could read right over that and just think he's talking about some bad people. But no, if you read the whole of Isaiah in an enlightened way, suddenly you have the story of the Rephaim.
Yes, Isaiah 14 is an amazing chapter because it describes the history and also the future of these entities and why they're relevant to us as Christians today. Isaiah 14, of course, is the famous chapter that condemns the rebel from Eden. How thou art fallen, O Lucifer, son of the morning. So in the context, you see that that's the entity who's being addressed here by Isaiah. But then when we see he is cast out of Eden, and when he falls, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you. It rouses the Rephaim to greet you. This is the moment at which Lucifer, Satan, is cast out from Eden to become Lord of the dead. And then we go back to verse 19, which you mentioned. There's a couple of interesting things here. The abominable branch, we do a word study on that, and a scholar brilliantly pointed out that the word translated abominable branch in Hebrew, netzer, is it's a prophetic reference elsewhere in Isaiah where it talks about the branch, the shoot that comes from the root of Jesse. But here he says, no, this is actually a loan word from Egyptian, which Isaiah would have been privy to because King Hezekiah, who ruled during Isaiah's day, was trying to make an alliance with the Egyptians as protection against the Babylonians and Assyrians. Netzer is a well-known word in Egyptian that means dead God, like a divinized dead king, or the Rephaim, who were the spirits of these mighty men who were of old.
And you go into this rather deeply in your book.
So in context, it makes sense. And then, of course, you go further down, and as we mentioned, the Watchers, who are the progenitors of these shades, these Rephaim, these dead kings of old. Verse 21 reads, prepare, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version instead of the King James, but prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. Now, I'm a Chicago kid, so I wonder, what's the problem with cities here? I mean, God had David in a city, put his name in Jerusalem, and there he will dwell forever. But again, it's another loan word. When we understand that the word for cities in Hebrew, Irim, is identical to the Aramaic word for watchers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with watchers.
And you know what? All those ancient cities, the biggest cities in the world, were dedicated to the gods.
Yes, that was common practice in Mesopotamia. Each god had its patron deity. Or each city had its patron deity.
Now, moving forward a bit, and this is the last I'm going to read from Isaiah, but I have to say this because Derek has such insight in this particular verse. We talked about it a minute ago. Isaiah 26:14, they are dead, they shall not live. They are deceased, they shall not rise. Therefore hast thou visited and destroyed them, and made all their memory to perish. They are dead. Who are they?
Well, this is another hidden reference to the Rephaim in the Old Testament. The word translated deceased is actually Rephaim. And the scholars, the great theologians of the last 2,000 years, didn't have access to some of the texts from the pagan neighbors of ancient Israel that have been translated within the last 50 years or so. And we understand now that in context, Rephaim means more than just run-of-the-mill dead. It means these divinized kings of old. The Canaanite, the Amorite neighbors of ancient Israel believed that their kings upon death would join the assembly of the Rephaim, or something that in some of these texts only translated since the 1980s, called the Council of the Tidanu, which is the origin of the name Titans of the Greeks. They believed that these spirits existed in the afterlife. Their kings would join this council. But what's interesting is when you skip down in Isaiah 26 to verse 19, you get a prophecy of their destruction. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. This is a prophecy of those who are faithful to God the Father, our Creator. You who dwell in dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. The thing is, the Septuagint translation renders this differently. The Jewish scholars who translated Hebrew into Greek a couple hundred years before the birth of Jesus, the Bible that would have been available to the apostles, actually translates that differently and renders that last sentence, the earth will give birth to the dead. The verb give birth, nephal, many scholars believe is the origin of the word Nephilim, which is possible, but everywhere else it's used in the Old Testament, it means to fall or has fallen. The Septuagint translators said the land of the impious will fall. In other words, scholars who look at that say, the Jewish translators of the Septuagint understood that this verse, this whole prophecy here, was a reference to the Rephaim, the giants, and their progenitors, the Titans, the Watchers. So if it's a reference to Tartarus, the land of the ungodly will fall.
Now, I have a special connection with Isaiah 26:14 because years ago, and I won't say how many years ago, but it's been decades ago, I read this and I started looking that word up, Rephaim, and that took me in a jillion other places. But the whole Old Testament talks about the Rephaim, the offspring of the fallen ones,
yes,
the Nephilim, and they were giants. But here's the thing, they are treated with absolute contempt by our Lord. That is to say, and by his prophets. And there's a deeper story. That is, once you begin to recognize that the Bible talks about the Rephaim in a very special way, suddenly you go another layer deeper and you have an amazing story about the old heroes, the Titans, the Olympians, the gods, the demigods, coming all the way, I think, down into our day, because there are literally thousands of gods being worshipped all over the world today, and they are a remnant of the fallen ones.
Yes, Paul makes it clear the pagans were worshiping demons.
And bringing us right up to today, you go to the movies, you you buy your ticket, you go in there, and you can actually sit down and be treated to 2.5 hours of superheroes who are nothing but cheap copies of everything the Bible talks about. And that's really what is exciting, I think, about your book, because anyone who reads this book is suddenly going to have their eyes open and say, wait a minute, this is real.
That's the thing that's really excited Sharon and me about this research that we've been doing for the last 4 years or so, is that it makes it very clear that the Bible has got all of the elements of these modern superhero stories. You've got wizards and sorcerers and monsters and demons and heroes and self-sacrificial love. And then when you realize that because this is actual history and that we are part of that history, we are part of a story that is much bigger than we are. We are part of the Fellowship of the Ring, if you will. Tolkien or Lewis or any of these great stories of quests. Think medieval knights with chivalry and honor and loyalty and love. And, it is the kind of story that would attract our youth groups, our kids, our teens, if we told them the story in these contexts. And God bless them, there are young men and women out there who are beginning to pick up on these stories and transfer this into teaching materials for youth groups. For this reason, because when kids understand that they are part of a story that's just as exciting as what they're seeing on the screens, except it's real.
Exactly.
Suddenly they get really excited about the Bible.
And I have to tell you, when I read Veneration by Derek and Sharon Gilbert, I thought, mission field. This is what hit me, because I know of so many families who have had so many teenagers get to a certain age and say, Mom, Dad, I know you raised me in the church, but you know what? I've outgrown that. I don't believe that anymore. So thank you very much. I'm leaving. I'm going to go off to college, and don't bother me with this Christianity garbage. It's just no longer pertinent to my life. And that's it. I've seen this happen hundreds of times, literally, as a pastor over the years. And suddenly I read your book, and if that group of people could be convinced, as you are.
One of the most exciting things we saw on our Israel tour this past year, 2019, was standing on Mount Nebo and looking down at the plains of Moab, where Moses and the Israelites camped before crossing over and attacking Jericho, which incidentally was named for the moon god of the Amorites, Yarik. And we go into some depth on the moon god in other books and why the moon god was so important. But down there, while they were on the plains of Moab, the Bible tells us that they began to worship a deity called Baal Peor. And we explain in Veneration that when you do a deep dive into the origin of that word, Baal just means Lord. Peor comes from a root that means cleft or gap or opening. But in the context, when you piece together the puzzle, it probably means entrance or opening to the underworld, because That was when God was provoked to send a plague among Israel for their worship of this entity that killed 24,000 Israelites, until Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron the priest, took a spear and stabbed a young Israelite man and Midianite woman who were engaging in some rite in the sight of Moses and all Israel, which was shocking. This pagan act that was taking place right there in front of the tent of meeting, or possibly even inside the tent of meeting. But that isn't what the psalmist in Psalm 106 verses 28 and 29 said was what provoked God. They said it was because Israel began eating sacrifices offered to the dead. They were lured into this worship of these ancient spirits that were believed to be the ancestors or the mighty kings of old, but were in fact the demons who proceeded from the Nephilim in the flood.
Now, are they coming back?
Yes.
Are they really, really coming back? I mean, there's a tendency, and by the way, for years, I must say, maybe even decades, I was one of those people who put the Titans and the Olympians in the mythological category. They were just nice stories written by the Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians, the Assyrians, but they weren't about real people at all. Now we know they are about real people. And it makes everything different in our world when we realize that there literally is a battle of the gods going on.
I mentioned those Rephaim texts from the ancient Amorite kingdom of Ugarit, written about the time of the Judges, around 1200 BC. They make reference to several rituals in which these Rephaim spirits were summoned through a necromancy ritual to the threshing floor of El, or the sanctuary of El. Well, that's a reference to Mount Hermon. The threshing floor, apparently a portal, and Sharon wrote a wonderful chapter in there on the imagery, the symbolism of the threshing floor, and the importance of threshing floors in the ancient world as portals. In fact, the threshing floor of Arana on the summit of Mount Moriah is where the Temple of Solomon was built. It is the Temple Mount today where we believe the final battle, Armageddon, will be fought. Ezekiel says, in Ezekiel 39, verse 11, he makes reference to the hordes of Magog being buried in a place called the Valley of the Travelers east of the sea. The word traveler in the Semitic is Avarim. Well, God said to Moses, climb this mountain of the Avarim to get your look at the promised land. Well, that's Mount Nebo. There's a place somewhere on the Exodus route, we believe right there on the plains of Moab, called Ayit HaAvarim, which means ruins of the travelers. And there's a site there in plain sight of the plains of Moab with 1,500 dolmens at the base of a ruined city. These dolmens are megalithic funerary monuments, like miniature Stonehenges, little trilithons of stone. The Israelites would have seen them there. But the key is in these Rephaim texts from Ugarit, in which they are summoned to the threshing floor of El. They mount their chariots, they travel first one day and then another, and arrive at dawn of the third day, where the word of El, the name of El, will revivify or resurrect the Rephaim, and they are specifically called travelers in those texts. And scholars agree that in Ezekiel 39, the reference to travelers is not talking about people on vacation on the King's Highway east of the Dead Sea. It's talking about these entities. They travel, they cross over from the land of the dead to the land of the living. These warriors of Baal will be in the army at Armageddon, and there they will fall.
And by the way, Derek, you're referring to Ezekiel 38, Battle of Gog. Everybody's got his private interpretation of the Battle of Gog. You need to read about this interpretation in Veneration. There are some very, very high spiritual battles being fought there, high-level spiritual battles. And it sort of takes me forward to Revelation, where Satan and his angels are gathered against Michael and his angels.
Yes.
And you try to visualize what that is, and it's very difficult, because we simply don't have the background, the history, the base to understand what it means when two groups of angels go to war. But I think you get a pretty good idea in this book, because you go back and reference all of the ancient references to supernatural creatures, as we would call them, but they were real, and there really was a battle.
Yes.
And the battle's not finished.
That's correct. And that's the thing that we remember. We need to remember when we look at the war of Gog and Magog, and we look at the uttermost north. That phrase translated in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is only used 3 places in the Bible, and the other 2 places refer to a mountain on the border between Syria and Turkey, right on the Mediterranean coast, called Mount Tsephon. And that is a reference to the mountain that everyone in the ancient world knew was the mountain where Baal's palace was located. That is the rallying point for Gog of Magog. It's a supernatural north that we need to look to, not is it Turkey, is it Russia? Well, yes, there will be human actors involved, but we need to remember that Gog of Magog is the Antichrist figure. He is the chief of staff for Satan, and that supernatural army, or a demonically infused army that comes against Israel for Armageddon, that's their headquarters, is this mountain that everyone in the ancient world knew was the headquarters for, well, Satan.
I wish we had 3 hours. We haven't even scratched the surface or begun to. The book is called Veneration by Sharon and Derek Gilbert. She got top billing, by the way.
Deserves it.
And by the way, she is a great researcher, I must say. Some people have a research-oriented mind, some do not. She does. But for your gift of $25, free shipping anywhere in the United States, you can read this book. It'll open your eyes. When I say it'll open your eyes, I mean more than that. Things you've wondered about all these years in the Bible will suddenly begin to pop into focus in ways that you did not expect. It's a great book. And by the way, as we do here at Prophecy Watchers, we put things together in packages. And if you want to buy a package, we're calling it this one the Sky Watchers package. You get Veneration plus the Wormwood Prophecy, Tom Horn's book, which is, by the way, gathering a lot of exciting accolades these days and references everywhere. And Unearthing the Lost World of the Cloud Eaters. Tom Horn has put those books together. I've got a presentation called It's All About the Seed, which is basically on the same subject. So we have a package here called the Sky Watchers package, yours for $60, free shipping anywhere in the United States. Go to our online bookstore and just scroll right down to the Sky Watchers package or to Veneration, or even to Derek Gilbert. You'll find them right there in our online bookstore, and you can order them there. And I hope you do. We are going to spend another broadcast with Derek. We have not scratched the surface here, and we're going to go a little deeper next time. Derek, less than a minute, what would you have people to know about your book?
That the spirit realm is real, and that God takes very seriously the protection of us from these entities who want to destroy us. It's when you look at this long war in context, God sent his only son to shed his blood to die for us, where these false gods who rebelled against our Creator want to shed our blood so that they can live forever. You know, when you think about it, that Last Supper, where Jesus gave the blood, the bread and the wine to his disciples to show his sacrifice. It's a complete reversal of that monthly ritual that the pagan neighbors of ancient Israel performed for their, well, what they thought were their ancestors, but were in fact the spirits of these demons.
Our God is love.
Amen.
Those other gods, well, not so much. Thanks, Derek. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm Gary Stearman. Hey, you keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com or follow us at facebook.com/prophecywatchers.